Talk about the migration crisis. As you know, this is something I feel very passionate about. The fact is that the government has said it will get on top of the migration issue. We saw 44,000 people coming here illegally last year. Of course, we've got RAF Wethersfield and Scampton. We've got the Bibby Stockholm, and yet still the numbers keep climbing. Now, over the last couple of days, there have been a number of articles about this, which is that Suella Braverman has claimed Keir Starmer, because he came up with a plan, basically. He said that actually what we need to do is to get back in bed with the European Union and make sure that we then allocate people who are fleeing water, fleeing countries and so on, the migrants that are moving around, and that essentially we need to share them out. Well, Suella Braverman has claimed that Keir Starmer would make Britain the dumping ground for EU migrants, and Labour has accused her of embarrassing nonsense. Here's the details. So Keir has indicated a Labour government could be prepared to do a deal with Brussels that would involve the UK taking a quota of asylum seekers who arrive in the bloc in exchange for the ability to return migrants who illegally cross the Channel to England. Now, the Home Secretary has hit back at this to say that actually this potential deal would mean that something like 100,000 migrants would come into the United Kingdom from the EU every single year. And of course, that is way in excess of the 44,000 that we saw coming in last year. Well, joining me now is Professor Sir John Curtis, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclye. Very good morning to you, John.
Good morning to you, David.
So this is politically a very hot potato, as you and I know very well indeed. I find this fascinating that Keir Starmer, I think, wants to appear statesmanlike, says we need to re-engage with the EU, will then divvy up the numbers that are arriving. The EU itself has major problems with the migration crisis, and now this has turned into a massive political football.
Well, it's become a massive political football for those like you and I who follow politics closely. Whether or not this story has landed with quite so much resonance in the wider public, I think is debatable. We've got a little bit of opinion polling now on how people are reacting to some of this. So, for example, when Find Out Now asked people whether they thought Sir Keir Starmer was too soft or too harsh on immigration, 44% said they didn't know. Coming somewhat more closely to the nub of the issue, we think also yesterday came out with some polling, which actually is the one poll that's really addressed the issue you've just pointed to, which is Sir Keir Starmer's plan to accept a quota of migrants shared out with the European Union in return for us being able to return illegal migrants to the UK who are coming across in the boats. Well, again, 33% of people said, I don't know whether this is a good idea or not. That said, it has to be said that this idea on this very early polling has landed perhaps rather better for Labour than the government would have hoped, because amongst those at least who have a view, 43% said, actually, this sounds like quite a good idea, and 25% said it did not. And this, of course, is against a backdrop where other polling this week found that, a record proportion of people, around 2/3, say they are dissatisfied with the way the current government are handling immigration. And it may well be that one of the problems the Conservatives now have in attacking Labour on this issue is that, whatever the merits or demerits of what Labour are coming up with, because the public are now so unhappy at the way in which the government are dealing with the issue, what the government has to say on this issue is not necessarily going to be believed by the public, including, by the way, many of those who voted Conservative in 2019.
I find that absolutely extraordinary, that the number of don't knows, when this is something that is electorally going to obviously influence the next general election. In terms of the numbers, we've already passed 23,000 into this country. Even the EU, which, as you know, is kind of my arch nemesis, even the EU has branded Keir Starmer's small boats policy delusional. So they don't think it will work. I think people like yourself and me who are interested in politics, essentially, the EU has a track record of not really wanting to cooperate. We've spent 500 million quid giving France money. That hasn't exactly worked out very well. And of course, I think it's just bonkers to think the EU is going to help the United Kingdom, because they don't like the fact we left. And so I don't understand the disconnect. Why is it that people don't know enough about this policy?
Well, it's a question. We don't know whether, but I mean, the honest truth is that most people will not have followed the detail of the policy. They may have just got to the beginning of the headlines. But I mean, David, I think you just have to remember that public attitudes towards the European Union are not quite where they were
Indeed.
back at the time of the 2016 EU referendum. And again, one other piece of polling in the last day was, is it important for us to cooperate with the European Union and to work with the European Union on immigration? Over 50% of people say it's very important for us to do so. So, whatever the merits of the arguments you're putting forward,
you're saying I'm wrong.
They're not arguments that are seemingly having resonance for a public which, of course, has seen. I mean, leaving aside the immediate issue of illegal immigration, the truth is that what the public have seen and now accept has happened is that following our departure from the European Union, legal immigration has gone up. And so again, this makes it rather more difficult for the government. One thing, by the way, you said, of course, we know that illegal immigration is going to be a crucial issue in the election. By no means is this obviously true. If you try to look to see whether or not this is an issue that is causing the Conservatives to lose votes, you discover that it doesn't prove to be very important. Now, the test I use here is it the case that those Conservative voters who think the government isn't handling illegal immigration very well, are they more likely to have defected from the Conservatives since 2019 than those who don't take that view? And the answer is no. In the end of the day, the crucial issue that the government has to settle, and the issue that is costing the government votes, is not immigration, it is the state of the economy. And I think the truth is that until the Conservatives are able to convince the public that they are able to run the economy in the wake of the Liz Truss fiasco, which has done them so much damage, focusing on the issue of illegal stopping the votes is in truth probably more successful at pointing at something where the public are doubtful about the government's record rather than something that's necessarily going to prove to be a means of persuading people to vote Conservative once again.
I mean, it's interesting, actually. I think what you say makes a lot of sense. Also, just in terms of Starmer and the positioning of the Labour Party, there is no doubt in my mind that they are moving towards the centre ground. In my humble opinion, this is where elections are won and lost. Also, Keir Starmer now looks like he's backpedalling on this idea of giving EU nationals the vote. That was one of the promises he made some years ago. But also, I just wonder if in the voters' minds, and maybe you have some polling, do people trust Labour now? Do they think the Labour Party is going far enough to solve the problems of this country, to make it an electable government?
Well, I think the answer to that is that on most issues, including, by the way, immigration, the public are more likely to say they think Labour can handle the issue well than the Conservatives. But we should also bear in mind that a lot of people say they're not sure that either of them could do so. So, this takes us back to the broader point that we know about where we're at the moment, which is the public are unhappy about the current government. They say they're willing to vote Labour, but it's not necessarily something they do with enthusiasm or necessarily with high expectations of what Labour might achieve. I mean, by the way, you're right to say that Labour are moving towards the centre. The other thing, of course, which is going on is the Labour Party are realising that we are in a very difficult fiscal situation, that the government has in many respects kicked the can down the road on this until after the general election. And to that extent, at least, they're already beginning to anticipate some of the difficulties they would face if they were to be in government after the election, i.e. if they were to overpromise now, they will create themselves political difficulties thereafter because, frankly, as one very famous former chief secretary put it back in 1997, there isn't any money left.
I remember that very well indeed, with the note that was left. Just in terms of the polling, and I looked at a number of polls this morning, it seems to me that Labour has, and you can correct me if I am wrong, but just looking across all of these, Labour around 44%, depending on the poll that you read. I've got Conservatives anything between 24 and 27%. Is there much flux going on there? Also, what's happening to the smaller parties?
Well, OK, so we're basically, on average, looking at around a 17, 18-point lead. That is not very different from the lead that Labour had after Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister In short, the Conservatives have made very little progress in the last 12 months at narrowing Labour's lead. And such progress as they had made, and they had made some, was essentially thrown away when the Conservatives failed to get in behind the Privileges Committee report that said that Boris Johnson had misled the House of Commons. In the immediate wake of that, what had got down to a 15-point Labour lead went back actually up to 20 points for a while and is now running at 18. And you have to remember the other issue that the government faces is that Boris Johnson is widely now regarded as somebody who did not tell the truth. He's been criticised for that by his own peers, and the party needs to be able to distance themselves from that, and they have failed to do so. So far as the smaller parties are concerned, well, reform are certainly still there, picking up the votes of some of the people who are in favour of being outside the European Union, who are unhappy with the Conservatives. They're running at around 6%. The Greens are still there. So the other counterpoint to in the way the Conservatives think they might be able to gain some ground by not being quite so keen on net zero, well, the Greens are picking up around 5-6%, much of that effectively nibbling at Labour's heels. The Liberal Democrats, well, frankly, they're flatlining. They're at 11%. It's more or less what they got last time. And I think in many respects, they ought to be disappointed where they're at, because an unpopular Conservative government is usually fertile ground for the Democrats to prosper. But they haven't been able to prosper from the Conservatives' difficulties during the course of the last 18 months.
And so, John, the big question, I guess, is if you were advising the government, when should the election be? If they hope to cling on to power?
Well, I think the honest truth is they have to play it long, but at least they have to play it as long as they can decently do so. And I think that points to the last Thursday in October of next year, before the clocks go back. Insisting on election in the dark is perhaps a bit too much, but that basically is as long as you can go on for. That seems decently reasonable.
Thank you so much for your words of wisdom. It's really good to talk to you. As ever, that's Sir John Curtis there, Professor of Politics at the University of Strathclye. Really interesting, actually, because obviously John brought out points I don't necessarily agree with, but also I think the migration is a big issue.
I think it's massive, and I think the thing is that polling now, it's one of those issues again that people are almost afraid to say.
Do you think people don't tell the truth?
Yes, because I think they're afraid to say that they want to end this migration, because then they're seen as unkind. And this is how it all works. So, and people are shouted at, you know, you're going to let people die. So I
guess it depends what question you're asked as well, doesn't it? It's the phrasing of that question. And as you know, actually sometimes you get the answers from the... Well, you compose the question to get the answers that you're looking for. I don't know. But the polls tend to be quite accurate.
Well, they don't. They absolutely don't, do they? They weren't accurate over Trump winning. They weren't accurate over Brexit. They weren't accurate over...
They definitely weren't about Brexit.
Right. They weren't accurate over Boris getting an 80-seat majority. That was also on a knife edge. They weren't accurate as way back as Major in '92, who was going to lose and got, you know, voted back in. So I don't think the polls are accurate, and I think they're becoming less accurate as time goes on, because we've moved into such a divisive society that you're scared to actually say what you feel.
So that's really interesting. You know, on the exit polls, when you've voted and you come out and they say, can I ask how you voted, which they're allowed to do, I don't think many people actually give you the proper indication, because as you rightly say, I don't think people want to tell you.
And you get sneered at. If you're against migration, if you're for Brexit, you're an unintelligent, right-wing, racist bigot.